The surveillance camera outside Dharavi's main railway station captured the moment at 6:47 p.m. on February 3, 2024. A 7-year-old girl in a yellow school uniform stands on the platform, clutching a worn backpack. Her name is Priya Sharma. She's waiting for her mother, who works at a textile shop 3 blocks away. The platform is crowded, hundreds of commuters moving in every direction, the usual chaos of Mumbai's evening rush. Priya stands near a pillar, just like her mother taught her. Stay visible, stay still. Wait. The footage shows her looking around, patient, trusting. At 6:51 p.m., a woman approaches her, mid-30s, wearing a blue sari, carrying shopping bags. They appear to speak for approximately 40 seconds. The woman gestures toward the north exit. Priya hesitates, then nods. At 6:52 p.m., they walk together off the platform. The camera loses them in the crowd near the exit stairs. Priya Sharma never arrives at her mother's shop. Her mother reports her missing at 8:15 p.m. Police review the footage within hours, identify the woman in blue, begin searching. They never find her. Not the woman, not Priya. And Priya isn't alone. Between January 15th and February 20th, 2024, 82 children disappeared in Mumbai. Not across months or years. 36 days. 82 children. Gone. Most from crowded public spaces. Most during daylight hours. Most with witnesses who saw something but not enough. And the pattern, when investigators finally acknowledged it, suggested something that Mumbai's police force, its government, and its media were unwilling to say publicly. This wasn't random. This was organized. This was hunting. For 5 weeks in early 2024, Mumbai experienced something that challenged every assumption about child safety, urban security, and the capability of one of the world's largest cities to protect its most vulnerable. 82 children disappeared in 36 days. Some were never seen again. A few were found, traumatized, and unable or unwilling to speak about what happened. And the official explanation, when it finally came, satisfied no one. The police claimed it was coincidence, a statistical cluster, unrelated incidents that happened to occur in proximity. But the numbers told a different story. Mumbai averages approximately 20 missing children reports per month. Most are found within 48 hours. Most are runaways or custody disputes. But in those 36 days, 82 children vanished, and the recovery rate plummeted. Only 11 were found. 71 remain missing. And the children who were recovered, the ones who came back, brought with them accounts that authorities worked actively to suppress. Accounts of coordination, of adults working in teams, of vehicles and locations and methods that suggested not opportunistic kidnappings, but systematic procurement. As if children weren't being taken randomly, as if they were being collected. But what if the truth behind these disappearances is far more disturbing than anyone realizes? What if the official narrative of unrelated incidents is a deliberate obfuscation designed to prevent panic? What if what happened in Mumbai in early 2024 wasn't an anomaly but a visible spike in something that's been happening for years, in Mumbai and cities across India, but that rarely gets connected because the victims are poor, because the families lack resources, because the system is designed to absorb these losses without acknowledgement? And what if the few children who were recovered and who tried to tell what happened were silenced, not because they were mistaken, but because their accounts revealed an operation so extensive, so protected, that exposing it would force authorities to admit they've been losing children to organized networks for decades? This isn't speculation based on conspiracy theories. This is analysis of official reports, leaked police documents, testimony from families, and the disturbing pattern that emerges when you map the disappearances against Mumbai's geography, against the demographics of the victims, and against the timeline of what investigators actually found but chose not to publicize. Mumbai is a city of extremes. 20 million people compressed into a space that was never designed to hold that many. Gleaming skyscrapers overlook sprawling slums. Wealth and poverty exist in such proximity that a child from a family living on $2 a day can stand meters from a luxury apartment where the monthly rent exceeds what their parents earn in years. This inequality isn't just economic, it's existential. It determines whose children matter, whose disappearances get investigated, whose families get media attention and public sympathy, and whose losses get absorbed into statistics, written off as the unfortunate but inevitable costs of urban poverty. Of the 82 children who disappeared in those 36 days, 74 were from lower-income families. Most lived in informal settlements. Most had parents who worked long hours in jobs that left children unsupervised for significant periods. These weren't children with nannies or private security. These were children who navigated the city alone, who knew the dangers but had no alternative, and who, when they disappeared, lacked the family resources to hire private investigators, to pressure police, to keep their cases in public consciousness. But disappearances of poor children in Mumbai isn't new. It's been documented for decades. What made early 2024 different was the concentration, the sheer number in such a short time, and the fact that this time, enough middle-class families were affected that the story couldn't be buried. Priya Sharma, the girl from the railway station, came from a lower middle-class family, but her mother worked for a shop owner with connections. That family pushed police, demanded action, got media coverage, and once the media started looking, once they started connecting cases that police had been treating as isolated incidents, the scale became undeniable. 82 children, 36 days, and the more journalists dug, the more disturbing the details became. Because this wasn't about stranger danger in the traditional sense. This was about systems, about adults who knew how to exploit the gaps in Mumbai's social infrastructure, who understood which children could be taken with minimal risk, who had logistics in place for moving children quickly, and who, evidence suggests, had been operating for years. The pattern of disappearances, when mapped, revealed something chilling. The children weren't taken randomly across Mumbai. They were taken from specific areas, railway stations, bus terminals, markets, crowded spaces where a child could be separated from supervision without causing immediate alarm. The method was consistent. An adult, usually a woman, would approach a child, would engage them in conversation, would offer help or claim to know the child's family. Witnesses, when they remembered seeing anything, described these interactions as seeming normal, not threatening. Just an adult speaking to a child in a public space, something that happens thousands of times daily in a city like Mumbai. And then the child would leave with the adult, voluntarily, trustingly, and they'd disappear. By the time family members realized the child was missing, hours had passed, the trail was cold, and the child was gone. Police initially attributed this to individual opportunism, but as cases accumulated, patterns emerged that suggested coordination. Multiple children disappeared from the same locations on different days, approached by adults matching similar descriptions. Women in their 30s and 40s, usually in traditional dress, carrying bags or packages that made them look like ordinary shoppers or commuters. Men who lingered near schools and playgrounds, not overtly suspicious, just present. And vehicles, reported by some witnesses, that would arrive shortly after a child left with an adult. White vans, small trucks. Vehicles common enough in Mumbai that no one paid particular attention, but that appeared frequently enough in witness accounts that investigators began to suspect they were part of an organized system, that children were being handed off, moved quickly through a network, taken to locations where they disappeared from any possibility of recovery. The few children who were recovered came back changed. 11 children, found between 2 days and 3 weeks after their disappearances. None were found through police investigation. They were abandoned, left at railway stations or markets, disoriented and traumatized. The youngest was 4, the oldest was 12. And what they said, in the fragmented testimonies that child psychologists attempted to collect, was consistent enough to be disturbing. They described being taken to buildings, different locations but similar descriptions, concrete rooms with no windows, multiple children present, adults who didn't explain what was happening but who maintained control through threat and confusion. They described being photographed, being given different clothes, being told they'd be going to new places. And they described fear, not just of violence but of something worse. The sense that they were being processed, evaluated, prepared for something they didn't understand but that filled the adults around them with routine efficiency. Psychologists noted that the children exhibited trauma consistent with trafficking. But when they tried to provide detailed reports to police, they encountered resistance. Authorities didn't want extensive documentation of what the children said. They wanted simple statements that could be processed quickly. And when families of the recovered children tried to push for further investigation, tried to insist that their children's accounts be taken seriously, they were warned, not overtly threatened, but given to understand that pursuing the matter would be unwise, that they should be grateful their children were returned, that digging deeper might attract attention they didn't want. And most families, terrified of losing their children again, stayed quiet, took their traumatized kids home, and tried to forget. But the trauma didn't forget. These children, now back with their families, carry memories of places and people that authorities claim don't exist. And the 71 children who didn't come back, whose families still wait, suggest that whatever happened to them was permanent. The investigation, such as it was, revealed cracks in Mumbai's child protection infrastructure that officials preferred not to acknowledge. The city has no centralized database for missing children. Different police districts maintain separate records. Coordination between districts is minimal, and the protocols for investigating child disappearances assume that most are runaways or custody disputes, not abductions. This means that the initial 48 hours, the period when recovery is most likely, are often wasted on procedures that don't apply to trafficking situations. By the time police realize a disappearance might be part of a larger pattern, the child has been moved, hidden, or worse. And because the victims are disproportionately from poor families, because they lack documentation, because many parents are illiterate and intimidated by police, reporting is delayed. Some families don't report immediately because they fear deportation. Many are migrants from rural areas living in Mumbai illegally. Others don't report because previous experiences with police taught them that reporting is useless. So the real number of missing children in that 36-day period is likely higher than 82. Possibly significantly higher. Those are just the ones that got officially recorded. Activists working on child rights in Mumbai weren't surprised by the spike in disappearances. They'd been warning about organized trafficking networks for years, but their warnings were ignored because acknowledging the problem would require resources, political will, and admission of systemic failure. It's easier to treat each disappearance as isolated tragedy than to confront the reality that children are being taken systematically and that the mechanisms to protect them are inadequate. One activist, speaking anonymously to foreign media because speaking publicly in India invited harassment, explained the dynamics bluntly. Poor children in India are invisible until they're useful. They're useful as labor, as beggars controlled by criminal networks, as organs in illegal transplant operations. And in the worst cases, as commodities in trafficking networks that move children across state lines, across international borders, into situations where recovery is impossible. The activist estimated that thousands of children disappear in India annually. Most are never found, and most investigations stop almost as soon as they begin, not because police are corrupt, though some are, but because the system lacks capacity and prioritization. Child trafficking is treated as lower priority than terrorism, drug trafficking, or financial crime. So the resources aren't there, the expertise isn't there. And the political pressure to solve cases quickly means that the ones that can't be solved easily get quietly filed away. The families of the missing children organized. By mid-February, as the number of disappearances continued to climb, parents began meeting, comparing information, realizing that their children's cases had similarities that police weren't acknowledging. They formed a collective, printed flyers, held vigils outside police stations, and they attracted attention that authorities didn't want. Because the families were asking questions that challenged the official narrative. Why were so many children disappearing from the same locations? Why did witnesses describe similar adults? Why weren't police connecting the cases? And most dangerously, why did it seem like there was an active effort to downplay the crisis? The collective hired a lawyer who filed public interest litigation demanding transparent investigation and publication of data. The court ordered police to provide detailed reports on each case. And what those reports revealed, or rather what they didn't reveal, was damning. Investigations were superficial. Most lasted less than a week before being classified as cold cases. Evidence was minimal. Police interviewed witnesses in only about 30% of cases. and follow-up was non-existent. Children were going missing, reports were being filed, and then nothing, as if the system was designed to document loss rather than prevent it. Media coverage was initially extensive but quickly became complicated. Major news outlets covered the story in its first weeks, especially after middle-class families got involved. But as the narrative became more disturbing, as suggestions of organized trafficking emerged, coverage shifted. Stories focused more on what parents could do to keep children safe. Practical tips, warnings about stranger danger. Less on the systemic failures and the possibility of organized networks. And when activists pushed journalists to investigate deeper, to look at connections between cases, to examine whether officials might be complicit, they hit walls. Editors killed stories. Reporters were reassigned. And the families who spoke too openly found themselves harassed. Anonymous calls suggesting they dropped the matter. Encounters with police on fabricated charges. Their children, the ones who'd been recovered, followed home from school. The message was clear: move on. And many did, terrified into silence. But a few didn't. A few parents continued pushing, continued demanding answers, and what they uncovered suggested the problem extended far beyond Mumbai. Similar spikes in child disappearances had occurred in other Indian cities. Delhi in 2019, Kolkata in 2021, Bangalore in 2022. Each time the pattern was similar: a concentrated period of disappearances, minimal recovery, and official responses that downplayed the crisis. Activists working across India began connecting cases, building a database that government refused to maintain. And what emerged was a map of trafficking routes. Children taken from cities moved to rural areas. Children from rural areas moved to cities. Patterns suggesting organized networks with reach across multiple states, and connections to industries where child labor is rampant: textile manufacturing, mining, agriculture, domestic work. Some children were being trafficked for labor. Others for begging operations controlled by criminal gangs who maim children to increase their earning potential. And in the darkest cases, children disappearing into networks that supply organs, or into international trafficking operations where Indian children end up in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, or Europe. The scope, once you started connecting the data, was staggering. Thousands of children, networks operating with impunity, and government response that ranged from incompetent to complicit. The question of complicity is where the investigation becomes most disturbing and most dangerous. Because organized trafficking at this scale doesn't happen without corruption. It requires officials who look the other way, police who don't investigate, bureaucrats who lose paperwork, politicians who block reform, and evidence suggests all of this is happening. The 11 children who were recovered and who provided testimony described being held in buildings in Mumbai, buildings that should be easy to locate. But when pressed to investigate specific locations, police claimed they couldn't find them. When witnesses came forward saying they'd seen children being moved in specific neighborhoods, police said they'd investigated and found nothing. And when activists tried to conduct their own investigations, they were blocked, threatened, sometimes arrested on spurious charges. The message was clear: stop looking. But why would authorities work so hard to suppress investigation unless there was something they didn't want found? Unless the networks doing this had protection? Unless exposure would reveal connections that powerful people needed to keep hidden? One theory that emerged, whispered among activists, but never provable, is that the trafficking networks aren't separate from power structures. They're integrated with them. That some of the people involved in taking children are connected to people in positions of authority. That the reason investigations get shut down is because following the evidence would lead to individuals who are supposed to be protecting children not facilitating their disappearance. This sounds like conspiracy theory until you examine cases where it's been proven. The 2018 Kathua case, where an 8-year-old girl was kidnapped, raped, and murdered, and where investigation revealed involvement of police officers and political interference to protect the perpetrators. The Deorala scandal, where child trafficking rings operated with police knowledge. These aren't isolated incidents. They're instances where the veil slipped enough that the public saw what was usually hidden. And they suggest that what happened in Mumbai in early 2024 wasn't aberration. It was visibility. A moment where the usual systems of suppression failed and people briefly saw what's always there. The dark side of this case isn't just what happened to the children. It's what the response revealed about value, about which lives matter, about which disappearances get investigated thoroughly and which get filed away. Priya Sharma, the 7-year-old from the railway station, got media coverage because her family had connections. But most of the 82 children didn't. Most were from families so poor that they couldn't afford to take time off work to push police. So marginalized that they didn't know how to navigate bureaucracy. So vulnerable that threatening them into silence was easy. And for those families, the disappearance of their child meant not just grief, but economic catastrophe. In poor families in India, children aren't just loved, they're survival. They contribute income. They'll care for parents in old age. Losing a child means losing future security. And the cruelty of trafficking is that it targets exactly those families least able to absorb the loss. It takes children from people who need them most and who have the least power to get them back. The climax of the investigation came not from police work, but from an accident. In late February, a traffic accident on Mumbai's outskirts involved a white van. The driver fled. Police responding to the accident found 4 children in the back of the van, ages 6 to 10, none from Mumbai, all from rural areas in other states. The children said they'd been told they were being taken to jobs, better lives. The van also contained documents, crude ledgers with names, ages, locations. Information suggesting this was one vehicle in a larger operation. This should have been the break that cracked the case open. Instead, it became another chapter in suppression. The documents disappeared from evidence. The driver was never caught. And the 4 children were returned to their home states with minimal investigation into how they'd been taken or where the van was headed. It was as if the evidence was too dangerous to pursue. As if what those documents might reveal, who they might implicate, was worse than letting traffickers continue operating. But photographs of the documents had been leaked to journalists before they disappeared. And what those images showed was chilling. This wasn't small-time operation. The ledgers listed hundreds of names, locations across multiple states, prices, children valued in rupees based on age, gender, health, and codes that analysts believed referred to destinations. Some children marked for domestic work, others for international movement, and some with codes no one wanted to interpret because the implications were too dark, that some children weren't being trafficked for labor, that there are markets for children that serve purposes we'd prefer not to acknowledge exist. Organ harvesting, sexual exploitation, ritual sacrifice, something that sounds impossible in the 21st century, but that documented cases suggest still happens in some of India's most isolated areas. The truth about where the 71 missing children ended up might be worse than anyone wants to imagine, and that might be why authorities worked so hard to suppress investigation. Because confirming the worst would require admitting we've built a society where some children can be taken and consumed, and the machinery of state does nothing. The aftermath of the 36 days is silence. Official silence. Media silence. And terrified silence from families who know speaking invites danger. The cases remain open technically, but inactive practically. The missing children are still missing. The few who came back still carry trauma that no one wants to document. And Mumbai has returned to its normal rhythm as if nothing happened. But the parents know, the activists know, and the children still navigating Mumbai's streets alone know, even if they can't articulate it, that something hunts in their city. That they're vulnerable in ways that children shouldn't be. That the adults responsible for protecting them have failed. And that if they disappear, as 82 children did in 36 days, the response will be bureaucratic documentation rather than genuine search. Their families will mourn. Some will fight. But the system will absorb their loss and continue on, indifferent, until the next spike in disappearances forces brief attention before settling back into willful blindness. The revelation isn't that trafficking happens. Everyone knows it happens. The revelation is scale and complicity. The revelation is that 82 children could be taken in 36 days in one of the world's largest and most surveilled cities, and the response could be so anemic. The revelation is that when you map disappearances against recovery rates, against police activity, against which families get attention and which don't, you see clearly that some children in Mumbai are effectively unprotected, that if you're poor enough, if your family lacks resources, you're prey, and the predators know it. They understand the system better than the system understands itself. They know which children can be taken with minimal risk. They know that investigations will be perfunctory. They know that public attention is brief, and that authorities would rather suppress than solve because solving would require confronting failures too massive to acknowledge. And so they continue. Not just in Mumbai, across India, across the world, taking children from families that can't fight back, moving them through networks that authorities claim don't exist, and delivering them to fates that we'd prefer to believe are impossible in our modern civilized world, but that continue nonetheless, hidden just beyond the range of comfortable sight. The families still wait, still hope, still imagine their children walking through doors that will never open again. They maintain shrines, hold birthday celebrations for kids who aren't there, and they live with the knowledge that no one in power cares enough to find out what really happened. The children who came back, the ones who survived whatever they experienced, will carry those experiences forever. They'll grow up knowing that the world isn't safe, that adults can't be trusted, that the system supposed to protect them failed, and they'll pass that knowledge to their children. That's the real legacy of those 36 days, not just 71 missing children, but an entire generation of Mumbai's poor learning that they're disposable, that their lives don't matter enough for genuine protection, that they exist in spaces between attention, and that in those spaces, things happen that the comfortable world prefers not to acknowledge. Things that have always happened, that are happening now, and that will continue happening as long as society remains structured so that some lives are valuable and others are simply data points and statistics no one wants to examine too closely. The question that haunts isn't just where the children went. It's why we accept this, why we've built systems that allow it, why we've normalized the disappearance of poor children to the extent that 82 going missing in 36 days creates brief concern and then silence. And whether, in our comfortable distance from Mumbai's slums, in our certainty that such things don't affect us, we're complicit. Because this isn't happening in isolation. It's happening in a world we've created, where inequality is so extreme that human lives have different values, where children can be commodities, where the machinery meant to protect the vulnerable instead processes their disappearance, and where most of us, reading about 82 missing children, will feel brief horror and then move on, our lives unchanged, while those 71 children remain wherever they were taken, lost, forgotten by everyone except families who don't have the luxury of forgetting. And that might be the darkest truth of all.